Students, in this video I'm going to talk about the history of China from 1500 to 1900. We're going to begin with the Portuguese. These are the pioneering European explorers, and we find them reaching Hong Kong around 1514, leading European exploration of the world outside of Europe, especially of Asia and the Americas. And so the Portuguese come to Hong Kong, they begin to establish trade with China, which at that time is ruled by the Ming dynasty who had overthrown the Mongols. The Ming dynasty doesn't especially encourage trade, but one interesting aspect of this early period in the 16th century is that although the Ming aren't particularly interested in European merchants, we know that they were impressed by the Jesuit astronomers, the Jesuit missionaries who came to China to try and convert the Chinese to Christianity, which they did with limited success, but still some successes. But it was their ability to predict the passage of the stars and the planets more accurately than Chinese astronomers that impressed the Ming dynasty. And this is significant because it's a sign of European scientific and technological knowledge is starting to move beyond that of the Chinese. And this, we don't have evidence for this before in history. Eventually, a new dynasty, the Manchu, come to power who replace the Ming, and they established the Qing dynasty, Qing. And the Manchu were outsiders, as so many rulers of China had been. And they are led initially by a ruler named Kangxi, that's Kangxi, who's considered one of the most successful and long-lasting rulers in history. And despite the fact that the Manchu are outsiders, Kangxi is able to blend together the Manchu with the native Chinese. Now we find the emergence of the English. And so where the Ming interacted with Portuguese explorers, the Qing are going to interact with English explorers. And the Qing don't particularly want the English to be very involved in their society either, but they allow them access to the port of Canton, but only to the port of Canton. So Canton becomes kind of like a Las Vegas of China. This is where you go to do trade with these kind of strange Europeans, and this is the only place where the Europeans are allowed to do trade. So it's kind of a city with a different set of laws and a different culture. It's during this period, from about 1400 to 1800, that we see a huge explosion of the Chinese population. New types of crops that are being brought in particular from the Americas, support a massive growth of the Chinese people, from about a population of 100 million in 1400 to a population of 400 million in 1800. A huge change. It's a huge change, and this huge growth in population means there's more pressure on resources in China, and it also means that the Chinese emperors have more of a struggle to control their subjects simply because they have more people who they're trying to control. We start to see as the 19th century goes on and Europe is increasingly industrialized, whereas China is not, that the European nations also are putting pressure on the Qing dynasty and centralized control of China. And we see this in the Opium War, which begins in 1839. Basically, the English wanted access, all the European countries did, but the English in particular wanted access to Chinese trade beyond Canton. They didn't want to be restricted to Canton. And so basically they start to pour opium into the Chinese economic system. They start selling opium to the Chinese. And there's a huge drive for opium. And as all the Chinese are coming and buying opium, it means that Chinese money is disappearing out of the country. And so the Chinese government gets more and more worried and eventually tries to shut down this trade by going to war. And it's at this point that the Chinese realize how far behind the English they really are, as the English just obliterate them. It's a humiliating defeat for the Chinese. And it's followed by a rebellion. Again, I said that as the Chinese population is growing, Chinese rulers are losing control of this larger population. And so you have this rebellion called the Taiping Rebellion that breaks out, and breaks out about 20 years later and is eventually suppressed, but only after 25 million people have died. That's a huge body count, even for a population of 400 million. And so there's this unrest in China, there's this discrediting of the power of the centralized emperor, and increasingly you see European nations exercising control in the coastal cities of China, and in the interior you see local warlords establishing their own independence. And so you have a breakdown of the centralized control of the emperors. And you have increasingly the Chinese are turning to Western influences. They're trying to maintain Confucian society, but increasingly they're more and more interested in Western technologies. They think they have to adopt these technologies in order to keep up and to protect and to preserve their country, and even to Western ideas. Until in 1911, a leader named Sun Yat-sen leads a rebellion that drives the Qing out of power. And it's based on the premises of the Western ideology of nationalism. The Qing are a Manchu people from modern-day Manchuria. They're not properly Chinese. China needs to be ruled by the Chinese, and so the Qing are overthrown, and Sun Yat-sen establishes a republic. And this is a sign of how divided China is at the beginning of the 20th century, and how they're increasingly looking to and are influenced by Western ideas.